All right, Rabbi, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors for this last daf of Bava Metzia. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Teri Czinn, for dedicating the Shiur Medrashos this month with gratitude to Hashem as they welcome their fifth grandchild, Gavriel Amichai Czinn, and loving memory of Steve's mother, Doris Czinn, Devorah Bas Rabbi Yisroel Yoel, Yisroel Yoel, Shaindy and Avraham Kelman, for dedicating all the Shiur Medrashos this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Avram's father, Rephael Yechiel ben Avraham, Mr. Jerome Kelman, Yisroel, and our week of learning sponsors, Berel Rachel Galkin, and the zechus refuah shleima for their nephew, Chaim Meir ben Tzirel Bluma. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, he together with Kol Chol Yisrael will have a complete and enduring refuah. All of the neshamas should have an aliyah. The families, our hostages, Emirat Hashem should come home. Our soldiers should be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yadehem. We should be zocheh Emirat Hashem to besoros tovos for all of Klal Yisrael. I will say, it is overwhelming and beautiful and holy to think about the fact that we are now embarking upon our last daf of Bava Metzia. There is good news for today. The good news is, you know that one way or another, by tomorrow, we have to be caught up with the rest of the Daf Yomi cycle. Right? So Baruch Hashem, there's always hope at the end of a Masechta that we're actually going to start with the right Daf tomorrow. But Baruch Hashem, I think one thing we've always seen in Daf Yomi is incredible hashgacha pratis about how the Daf will work out, the timing works out. So we have a little bit more to do today than the rest of Klal Yisrael. But Baruch Hashem, we also have a little bit more time to be able to do it, and that's an incredible zechus. I often say that sometimes Daf Yomi Gemara is like fine wine. So you don't just gulp it down and say, oh, that was nice. You savor it. So sometimes it means you even drink it a little bit more slowly than you would normally want to drink it, because you just want to unlock the flavor of every beautiful droplet. So Torah alachas kama v'kama. Torah is better than anything. So sometimes the opportunity to just pump the brakes a little bit, slow down a little bit, and take it in. Just ingest it into our neshamas just a little bit more slowly is such an incredible zechus. So with that, today's daf is Kuf Yud Tes, but we are starting nowhere near Kuf Yud Tes. We are starting on Kuf Yud Ches Amud Beis 118b. And actually, the truth is, I ran through the Mishnah yesterday, so we actually have time. Let's just do the Mishnah. Hamotzi Zevel Rishus Harabim. So we'll say a person goes ahead and takes their menorah out into the public domain. So we're going to talk about this, interestingly enough, about certain halachas, the opportunity that one has to utilize Rishus Harabim for certain activities of daily living. Well, that's what we'll call it for now. So Hamotzi Zevel Rishus Harabim, Hamotzi Motzi V'Amzal Mezabel. So you're allowed to go ahead and remove your menorah out. And we'll discuss why someone is moving their menorah out into Rishus Harabim. We'll talk about that. So the person who's taking it out has the ability to do so, but really can't let it linger there. In other words, you can take it out and then it's got to be removed. So really, it requires coordination. Let's say Reuven is the menorah owner and Shimon is the guy who's going to take it. So it requires some level of coordination between Reuven and Shimon. Okay. Ein shorin tid b'Rishus Harabim. You can't go ahead and soak clay in Rishus Harabim. Ve'in lovnim levanim. Nor can you go ahead and make bricks. So I'll say, so the idea over here is these are more labor-intensive activities that take a bit more time. So again, we're going to see that you could utilize your Rishus Harabim for your own private needs. And all this is referring to the fact that you have property adjacent to Rishus Harabim. So because of that, I really need Rishus Harabim a little bit as like a staging area. So you're allowed to utilize that, but you're only allowed to utilize it in short spurts of time. So any activity that's more labor-intensive, or really not labor-intensive, that's prolonged, you can't use Rishus Harabim. Aval govlin tit Rishus Harabim, but you can knead clay in Rishus Harabim, aval lo levanim, but not bricks. So bricks themselves can never be made in the public domain, because that is too involved in the process. Habona Rishus Harabim, hamevi avanim mevi, v'habona bona. So we'll say if you are building in Rishus Harabim. Now, interestingly enough, look at Rashi, v'habona bona makami adamevi ubona. So we'll say, so remember again, if one is building in Rishus Harabim, really what it means is if one is building in adjacent to Rishus Harabim, so then halacha l'maisa, maybe if you're bringing bricks, stones, v'abona bona, v'imhizik mishale mashehizik. So Rabbi says, so this is a very important halacha. What this is saying is like this. So what we're saying from this Mishnah is that there is a license to use Rishus Harabim even for my own personal purposes, right? So again, I'm building a home adjacent to Rishus Harabim. I'm going to need to stage to do certain things in Rishus Harabim. Do I have a license to do so? Yes. But I will say, here's what's interesting. The Mishnah is teaching me, license does not mean freedom from responsibility. So whereas I have a right to, let's say, for example, using the example of the Mishnah, I have the right to go ahead and knead clay in Rosh Hashanah. Right? So what happens? So to build my home. So now some of the clay, falls out of the, I don't know what you need clay in, but let's call it the clay bowl. Right? So some of the, right, that's the technical term, right? So some of the clay spills out, and Shimon's walking by, and Shimon slips and breaks his leg. I'm responsible for that. Now, the idea over here is, even though, of course, I have the right to go ahead and utilize it, but right does not mean freedom from responsibility. We'll say again, remember, you have the license, but you are not freed from responsibility. Rabbi Shmuel says, Rabbi Shmuel even goes a step further. He even holds it halacha l'maisa. You could even use Rosh Hashanah as a more dramatic staging area. So you could even put materials in there up to 30 days. Up to 30 days before the project begins, in order to go ahead. Rashi says, "Metakin mizamin Rosh Hashanah ve'eno chayiv b'nezikin." Now, Rabbi Shmuel is saying two things. Number one, that you could use Rosh Hashanah as a staging area for your personal project up to 30 days before. And Rabbi Shmuel, unlike the Tanakama, holds that once you have a license to use, you are also freed from responsibility. See here, there's interesting machlokes over here. So in other words, does license represent exemption from responsibility or not? Tanakama, it does not. Rabbi Shimon, it does. Okay, let's analyze. So we'll say our Mishnah doesn't reflect the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Why? What does Rabbi Yehuda say? Disanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, B'shas hotzas zivalim adamoti zivala l'shsabim v'tzovro kol shloshim yom k'dei sheyeh nishuv beragle adam uberagle behema shaminas kain hinchil Yoshua liyisrael es haaretz. So we'll say this is very interesting. So Rabbi Yehuda holds like this. At the time, apparently it was like a seasonal thing to clean out the manure. So at the time you're cleaning out the manure from your barn, from your stable, from your field, the halacha is you're allowed to go ahead and literally pile it in Rosh Hashanah for 30 days. Now here's the chap. It's interesting. Why are you piling manure in Rosh Hashanah? Because apparently manure is only usable, or say excrement becomes usable as fertilizer, as manure, once it's trampled on. I guess that's the processing for it. So the idea is you put it out in Rosh Hashanah, let people walk all over it for 30 days. I'm sure they give you a tremendous thank you for that. Right? Walk all over it for 30 days, right? And then you take it back and utilize it. So we'll say, now watch this. Now, Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa shaminas kain hinchil Yoshua liyisrael es haaretz. That this was one of the stipulations that Yoshua made in Eretz Yisrael. So now, what does this mean? We've seen this before, that Eretz Yisrael is inhabited by Klal Yisrael based upon certain, we'll call it interpersonal or relationship contracts. There's an understanding of, in order to live in a land together, there has to be certain understanding, certain agreement, a certain collaboration between different segments, or in this case, again, different tribes of Eretz Yisrael, different individuals of Eretz Yisrael. So Yoshua said like this, there's something called Rosh Hashanah, but the problem is now Rosh Hashanah on one hand belongs to no one, but also belongs to everyone. On the one hand, you can't start doing your private business in Rosh Hashanah, but on the other hand, sometimes there are things for which you need the Rosh Hashanah. So there has to be an understanding. We'll say it's such a profound yisod. There has to be an understanding. That at the end of the day, so even though public domain, no one person could impede its use by someone else, we have to learn to work together. And sometimes learning to work together means I'm going to give up something of mine so that right now you could benefit, because later on you're going to give up something of yours so that I could benefit. So therefore, again, the rabbim are going to give up right now a little bit of convenience of Rosh Hashanah. There's going to be menorah everywhere, right? Because Reuven needs this, but it's okay because next week Shim is going to need it, and then Levi's going to need it, and we're all going to have our opportunity when we sacrifice for each other. When we sacrifice for each other, at the end of the day, we all benefit. I think if there's sometimes one of the greatest lessons that we still have yet to learn is this concept that in order to be able to go ahead and live together in Eretz Yisrael, the way Yoshua, the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu set it up, is we have to be willing to sacrifice for each other. No one person, no one community, no one segment has the right to just go ahead and receive and not give. Everyone has to contribute in some way, and everyone has to be willing to sacrifice for each other in one way. That's the way Yoshua set up Eretz Yisrael. Incredible. So the point over here, Bose, is that the Gemara is saying is, our Mishnah doesn't reflect the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Right? Why not? Why not? Because again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this is very interesting, Rabbi Yehuda holds that Allah L'maisa, once Yoshua instituted it this way, you have the right and what? No responsibility. So in other words, if I have the right to put out my manure, if someone slips and breaks a leg on my manure, I'm not responsible for that because Yoshua, so to speak, gave me the license for that. Our Mishnah clearly says you have the right, but you have responsibility if something happens, someone gets damaged. Teri Czinn says, no, not necessarily. Afilu teim Rabbi Yehuda. It's true that it can even be Rabbi Yehuda. How so? Rabbi Yehuda she'im hizik chayiv l'shalim. Because also Rabbi Yehuda, again, there's no reason to say Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda also agrees. There's a right. There's a responsibility. Right? But I'm sorry, there's a right, but there's also a responsibility. I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, it's also incredible. You know, we see this today, right? That like Baruch Hashem, right? Even though we are in Galus, we thank God we're in a country, even with all of the surge of anti-Semitism, we're in a country where Baruch Hashem, hopefully again our rights continue to be protected. And it's incredible to see that people don't understand that your ability for free speech doesn't give you freedom from responsibility. Even though in New York apparently it's not like this. You could have free speech and damage universities and do whatever you want, and there is no responsibility. But then, see, when you go ahead and you let people off with no responsibility, you're undermining the very fabric of society. That's the Mishnah's teaching. You have rights. I mean, there's a whole discussion about whether Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Devorah, has a whole discussion that in Judaism we do not believe in rights. We believe in responsibilities. Okay, but leaving that aside, let's look at this over here as a right. So, right, you have a right to utilize Rosh Hashanah, but that right always comes with a responsibility. So the Gemara says, maybe even though Rabbi Yehuda is saying you're allowed to go ahead and push your menorah to the Rosh Hashanah, that's fine. Who says you're not responsible for that? In other words, somebody gets damaged, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree you're responsible. I have a hatanan, we learned, she potter, I also remember again from our Shabbos days. Right? Rabbi Yehuda holds, also from our Bava commentaries, Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead, I remember again, Ner Chanukah in its purest form, where is it kindled? Where is it, right? It is kindled outside. So let's say again, I'm kindling my Ner Chanukah. I live right next to Rosh Hashanah, right? So I put my Ner Chanukah by my doorway, and Reuven's leading his laden animal through Rosh Hashanah. The animal has its grain stacked, length, widthwise, right? His grain catches on fire from my Ner Chanukah. I'm potter. Why? Because I am acting responsibly and legally. My love, Rishus the Beis Din. Are we not talking about Rishus of Beis Din? In other words, see, what do you see from here? You see from here that when you have a right to do something, a legal right, then you are freed from responsibility. So I have a right to put my Ner Chanukah there. Therefore what? Therefore halacha l'maisa. Ultimately, I'm freed from responsibility. To which the Gemara says, no, lo rishus de mitzvah. No, Ner Chanukah is different. I will say, why is Ner Chanukah different? Because lemaisa, I am performing a mitzvah. So that's different. I will say. So interestingly enough, apparently there are different, what we'll call different rights. Right? So there's the right of usage, which could be a rabbinically legislated right, or Yoshua ben Nun legislated right. And then there's mitzvah obligations. In a mitzvah obligation, there very well may come a petor, an exemption, ultimately again from responsibility or from legal liability, right? But lemaisa, when it comes to a rabbinic entitlement to utilize something, that still comes with responsibility. Okay, Vatanya, we learned kol elush amru mutar lekalkal b'shusarabim. Look at the Brisa. The Brisa says in all of these cases where we said that a person is permitted to do something quote-unquote destructive in Rosh Hashanah. I will say, right, I want to be clear. When we say like kalkel b'Rosh Hashanah, that doesn't mean you're destroying stuff. It means you're doing stuff which is objectively detrimental to others. Which again, I think we'd all agree, putting your menorah out in Rosh Hashanah is kilkul. It is. I have a right to it, but it's kilkul. So im hizik chayiv l'shalim. Ultimately, again, if I damage someone, so in other words, I have the right, but if someone slips and falls and breaks their legs, I'm chayiv. Rabbi Yehuda poter. Rabbi Yehuda says, you're poter. So he spent all this time trying to fit Rabbi Yehuda into the chayiv, and now he says, by the way, Rabbi Yehuda says, you are poter. Ella, mechavarta masnisin delok Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara says, you know what? I think you're right. I think our Mishnah doesn't reflect the view of Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, so full circle over here. We'll say, the power of a Gemara like this is, let's understand what we tried to do. What we tried to do is we tried to reconcile opinions. Right? Remember again, our Mishnah says you have a right to utilize your sarabim in certain limited ways, right? But if you do so with a legal right, but you damage someone, you are responsible. The Gemara wanted to suggest that our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says that right comes with legal exemption. You're not chayiv. We then tried to show, no, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree. Right? But again, the Gemara comes full circle and says, no, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree. Rabbi Yehuda holds that once you have a right to utilize your sarabim, that right comes with exemption from liability. I will say a tremendous Musar skill in life. You should always try to reconcile opposing opinions. You should always try to reconcile. Right? It's always good to make shalom. But it's also okay to come out at the end of the day and say, you know what? We are not going to agree. We're not going to agree. But even if you can't agree, you have to learn how to live on the same page. I'll say, isn't that the greatest musar of all of Gemara? That you could disagree with someone vehemently, ideologically, irreconcilably. Right? We are bitter intellectual enemies, bitter halachic enemies. We're never going to agree. Yet, we find an opportunity to live on the same page. That is the gadlus of Gemara, and it is the secret. It is the secret to this, not such a secret, to the success of our people. The ability to disagree agreeably, to disagree yet vehemently, but yet still find a way to live together on the same daf of Gemara. Incredible. So let's go weiter. Says Gemara. So what we are left with right now is a fundamental machlokes. Right? Everyone agrees that these entitlements exist, right? So, for example, you're allowed to, at some point, we'll see the Rambam in just a little bit, but you're allowed to go ahead and put your menorah into the Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so that we've already established, right? How long? We'll see all of that. If somebody gets hurt on my menorah, am I liable? So that's a machlokes. Tanakama says yes, there is responsibility. Rabbi Yehuda says no. So just be aware of this machlokes, and in Metzia Hashem, we'll see resolution in just a little bit. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon, Kulu Sfir Lahu, Komakom Shinasan Chachamim Rishus Vehizik Pater. So we'll see, now we come to something very interesting. Abai comes along and says like this: these three opinions, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and Rabbi Shimon, all subscribe to this same concept that wherever Chazal gave you the right to do something, they also freed you from liability. Okay? So the Gemara is like this. Rabbi Yehuda Hadamas. Rabbi Yehuda, we just said, right? Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says that halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead and you empty your menorah into Rosh Hashanah, right, and somebody gets hurt on it, you are pater. That's it. So that's Rabbi Yehuda. Wherever there's a legal right, there's also exemption from liability. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, what does Rabbi Shimon Gamliel say? Interesting case here. This is not Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer, af metakein hu es malachto lifnei shloshim yom. They both say Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is our Mishnah. Right? Our Mishnah, what did he say in our Mishnah? You can even stage, right? I'm building a home next to Rosh Hashanah. I want Rosh Hashanah property. Right? Some people want waterfront, some people want Rosh Hashanah. So I'm building a house right by Rosh Hashanah. And now again, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says I could stage the materials there for 30 days beforehand. And halacha l'maisa, I go ahead and if something happens during those 30 days, I am permitted to go. I'm exempt from liability. Okay, that's Rabbi Shimon. What's Rabbi Shimon? The Gemara says this nine haya ma'amido ba'aliyah sarach she'ei tachtav ma'aziva shlosha tvachim ubekira tefach. So also this is actually an interesting case here. So the Gemara says as follows. Look at Rashi. Haya ma'amido ba'aliyah. Rashi says over here, Mishnahi b'Bava Basra. Oh, okay. Bava Basra shbelo yachbar lo yamod adam taner b'soch habayis ele imkein yesh al gabav chalal gova dalet amos v'pnei atanar l'aliyah. Both say if you live in a multi-story unit and you want to go ahead and install a. One second. Yeah. So hayamamidu ba'aliyatzar sheitachtav ma'aziv. Okay, so Rashi's going out of order. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, if you want to go ahead and install a kira or a tanner, these are different types of stoves. The point is, you have to have a certain amount of space above the stove and a certain layer of plaster underneath the stove. The idea over here is the heat of your stove can't negatively impact your upstairs neighbor or your downstairs neighbor. So essentially, we'll say they're saying you have to vent it, right? We have vented. There has to be airspace above and layers of plaster below. So that's the lashon of air. If you're having your oven in an aliyah, we'll say I'm not getting into it now, but there's a difference in halach between a kira and a tanur. Two different types of ovens, but again, for our purposes, it's not. We don't need to get into this right now. So if you're putting your oven in an aliyah, there has to be a 3 tefach layer of plaster underneath it. Ubikira tefach, that's for a tanur, and for a kira, which is a smaller oven, 1 tefach. V'im hizik mishalim mashe hizik. But ultimately, I will say, so let's say you took these precautions, right? In other words, I had 4 amas of space between my oven and the ceiling. I had 3 tefachim of plaster underneath my oven as well. And I will say, despite that, so I took the necessary precautions, and despite that damage occurred, Tanakama says, Yechayev. Rabbi Shimon says, listen to this incredible. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Lo Amru Kol Hashem Alalu, Ela Shem Hizik Pater Milashalem. Shabbos said, this is really quite amazing. Rabbi Shimon says, no, that's the whole point. The whole point of these obligations is, once you've taken them, or precautions is, once you've taken them, you are free from liability. Rabbi said, this is, we're going to get into Zohar Basra, but this is really fascinating. In other words, I did what I was supposed to do, but damage still occurred. Am I liable or not? The Tanakama says, yeah, of course you're liable. I got it. I don't know, maybe there's something with your kira, or maybe there's something else going on, maybe there's about the type way that you're cooking. Whatever it is, Tanakama is going to say, even though, thank you for taking the necessary precautions, but if you damaged, you are still going to be chayav. Rabbi Shimon says, no. Shabbos says, so again, we're lumping Rabbi Shimon here. What does Rabbi Shimon essentially say? When you do what you're supposed to do, right, then Allah Chalamai, so you are freed from liability. So I just want to point out, Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel are talking about cases of permitted usage. When you have a permitted right of usage, you are exempt from liability. Rabbi Shimon is talking a little bit of a different case where you've done what is obligatory upon you. You are freed from further damage or any potential damage. Okay, but we're lumping them all together, that essentially all of them subscribe to this idea that when you are operating, right, within the parameters of your legal rights and damage occurs, you are not chayev for that. Incredible. We'll see that case, that halacha ma'aseh case in Bava Basra. We'll say we end off this section with a very interesting halacha. Shimon, good. So the Gemara goes weiter. Hachatzav shemasra l'sasas hasasas chayiv. So we'll say, so now we're talking about over here. This is fascinating. In the topic of building homes, we're talking over here about the supply chain, right? How the supply chain is going to work. So this is quite fascinating. So now we'll say, so hachatzav shemasra l'sasas. Chatzav is the guy who literally again mines the stone from the quarry. So the chassav gives it to the sasas. The sasas is like the chiseler. He's the guy who's going to chisel the stone down to make it a usable unit. Right? So once the quarrier, we call him quarrier, goes ahead and gives it to the chiseler, ultimately again a sasas chayiv. So the chiseler takes responsibility, and ultimately again the quarrier is no longer obligated if any kind of damage occurs. Hasasa shemasra l'chamar. So again, once the chiseler gives it to the donkey driver, the transport guy, then hachamar chayiv. Then ultimately liability shifts to the donkey driver. Hachamar shemasra l'kasef. Once the donkey driver gives it to the carrier, this is the guy that literally carries the star on his back. Right? So ultimately, akasav chayiv. Akasav shemasra l'banai. So once the guy who's carrying it gives it to the builder, ultimately, again, the builder is chayev. Abanai chayev. So what it's saying is, again, once each person does his job and hands it off to the next guy, he's freed from liability, and any damage that occurs devolves upon the guy who is currently handling the stone. Habanai shemas la'adrikal. So once the builder, so to speak, gives it to the bricklayer, so adrikal chayev. Ultimately, again, the bricklayer is chayev for any damage that occurs. V'miniach even ala dimos ve'zika. Once you go and you put the stone, you put the brick on the wall, and now let's say it falls off and it does damage. What's the halacha? Kulan chayavin. Interesting. Everybody involved in this process shares in liability. So in other words, during their respective jobs, they each have personal liability. But once it's put on the wall, and then it falls off, and let's say it does damage, there's collective liability. Where it says, okay, v'atanya achron chayav v'kulam peturin. I learned in a braysa. How could that be? Right? It could only be that the bricklayer is going to be chayav and everyone else is going to be pater. To which the Gemara will say, lo kashya kan b'schirus kan b'kablonas. So I'll say this is actually quite fascinating over here. Ultimately, everything depends on the nature of the engagement. So I'll say there are two different ways that you could hire this group. You could hire them ultimately, again, b'schirus. Schirus is you're hiring each of them as independent contractors, right? I'm hiring a quarrier, I'm hiring a chiseler, I'm hiring a transporter, I'm hiring a porter, right? I'm hiring a builder, a bricklayer, right? And each of you guys are individuals. So obviously, when they're doing their respective jobs, they're chayiv. Once they finish their job, they're out. Kablonas means I'm hiring them as a group. This is a chevra. I'm hiring this as a group. When I hire them as a group, interestingly enough, when they're each executing their own jobs, again, there's personal liability. Once they finish their individual jobs and the brick is laid down on the building, then they once again assume collective responsibility for what happens to that brick. So quite interesting. In other words, if that brick is put on the wall, then it falls off, it breaks, or it falls off and hurts someone, there'll be collective responsibility for that. Now, how long that extends for is a different discussion, but I will say that that's the halacha. So I just want to mention to you, just the Rambam in Hilchos Niskei Mammon Halacha Yigimel very quickly, because we do have to finish the daf today. So he says over here, Yesh l'cha adam l'hotzies hazeva v'agalalim m'shus harabim b'shas otzaz zvalim. So we'll say, the way the Rambam understands this is that halacha l'maisa, yes, there was a menorah season. I know, it feels like you want to be out of town for that, right? But l'maisa, there is such a thing like that. And during menorah season, you could bring out your menorah to Rishus Harabim. You could do that. Not only there, you could keep it piled up there for 30 days. What was the whole chap? Pedestrian traffic trampling over it. Pedestrians, wagons, animals, that's the whole chap. And it makes it into usable fertilizer. Now, both say, again, so therefore there is a license to use this, and the Rambam goes through all the different things that you could use Shurabim for. But both say, here it is, V'yafal pikein, im hizik chayiv l'shalim. So I will say, the Rambam paskins, whereas you have this right, the right does not free you from liability. So therefore, again, you have the right to put your menorah out there, but if something happens, someone is injured, you are absolutely unequivocally responsible for any damage that occurs. So I will say, so he passed like the Tanakama, not like Rabbi Huda, not like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and not like Rabbi Shimon. Incredible. Good. We'll say that's the halacha l'maisa. So let's go back there. There's a lot more, by the way. There's a lot more to this because it happens to be this concept of how you're allowed to use Rosh Hashanah, for what time frame, for what activities is fascinating. But again, for our purposes for today, that will suffice. Mishnah. Oh, sorry, last Mishnah, Maseches Bava Metzia. Last Mishnah. Okay, Shtei Ganos Zu Al Gav Zu. Vayerek Bein Sayin. We'll say this is a fascinating case. To illustrate this case, the best way to illustrate it, we'll say, is one of the most incredible things that you can see in Eretz Yisrael is terrace farming. Right, so what's terrace farming? When you live in a mountainous region, so remember again, generally in order to go ahead and farm, right, you have flat land. Well, what do you do in a mountainous region? So what you do is you carve out stages of the mountain. So that's why, if you ever see this, well, so you can see this everywhere in Eretz Yisrael, everywhere. You see this lot in Eretz Yisrael where again, essentially, what they do is you have a little bit of a flat area. Then what they'll do is they'll carve out part of the mountain, put in a retaining wall, essentially a retaining wall, right? And then you have another field, and then a retaining wall, and then another field. So in this case over here, it doesn't have to be a retaining wall. You have two different gardens, right? Two different gardens on two different levels. So imagine for a moment, Reuven has an upper level garden, Shimon has a lower level garden, and there is a wall of dirt. There's a wall of dirt in between those two. So literally, terraced farming. Terraced farming, there's a wall of dirt in between. Now, what's the chap? This is fascinating. Suddenly now, there are vegetables growing out of the dirt wall, the retaining wall. So what's the shayla? Who gets that produce? So here we go. So there is produce growing out of the retaining wall, right? So what's the halacha? Rabbi Meir says it belongs to Reuben, the upper garden. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shal Tachton, no, it belongs to the lower garden. Amar Meir, in Yirtzah Elyon Nikach as Afro in Kanyerek. So Rabbi Yehuda says like this, I'll tell you why it belongs to the upper guy, because if the upper guy wants to take away his soil, right, if he wants to take away his soil, then there is no produce. In other words, remember, so what Rabbi Meir essentially is saying is that vegetable is growing in the soil of the upper field. Right? So granted, it's coming out of the side, coming out of the retaining wall, but it is growing in the soil of the upper field. So to speak, if you were to take away the soil of the upper field, there would be no growth. On Rabbi Yehuda, in Yirtzat Tachton Lamalos as Gano in Kanyarek. Well, I can say like this: if Shimon decided that he wanted to fill in his garden with dirt, right, and make it even to Ruvain's, there would also be no vegetable. Right? So in other words, there'd be no room for the vegetable to grow. So therefore, again, it should belong to Shimon, to ultimately the lower garden. Rabbi Meir, so I'll say, so therefore, this is machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Meir says it belongs to the upper garden because it's growing in his soil. Rabbi Yehuda says it belongs to the lower garden because Lamai says only because the lower garden chooses not to fill in his field that this vegetable could grow at all. Rabbi Meir says like this: Me'achar sheshnein yecholim limchos ze al zev. So Meir says, since the truth is both of them seem to have a valid taina, so we look from where does this vegetable derive its sustenance. Now look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, 3 lines up from the bottom, so Meir is saying like this, you're right. So Meir is saying to Rabbi Yehuda, I hear your point, but at the end of the day, from where is this vegetable deriving its sustenance? And the answer is the soil of the upper field. So therefore, again, by definition, it should belong to the upper field. So the Gemara goes back to I'm sorry. Rabbi Shimon, Kol Sha'elyon Yochol Lifshot Es Yadov Litol Harei Hu Shalo. So Rabbi Shimon says that essentially like this: wherever the reach of the upper garden could extend to. So when Reuben stands in his garden, wherever reaching down, wherever he could reach, that's his. Now, obviously, we'll say this is not going to apply if he could reach down into Shimon's garden. Obviously, it's not going to apply to that. What it means is anything that's growing out of the sidewall, the retaining wall, if he could reach it, it belongs to him. Vashar shal tachton, and anything else that he can't reach, ultimately goes ahead and belongs to Shimon. So both say. So interestingly enough, Rabbi Shimon seems to suggest a little bit of a middle of the road approach, which is that halacha l'maisa. So we have this machlokes Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is saying stuff growing out of the side retaining wall belongs to the upper garden. Rabbi Yehuda is saying stuff growing out of the retaining wall belongs to the lower garden. Rabbi Shimon says like this: essentially, if Reuben standing in his upper garden can reach it on the retaining wall, it's his. If he can't reach it, it belongs to Shimon. All right, Devorah said last Gemara. Amar Rava beikaro kuli amalo pligi de elyon havi ki pligi benofo. So we'll say Rava says like this. It's actually very interesting. Look at Rashi. Beikaro sharshei yerek benofo lefishin tlim bagras. So we'll say, listen to this. So everyone agrees, and when talking about the root of the plant, right, the root of the item growing in the retaining wall, everyone agrees that belongs to Ruvain, the upper garden, because it is growing in his soil. Remember again, that retaining wall soil is the soil of the upper garden. So everyone agrees that when it comes to the root, ultimately, again, the root belongs to Ruvain. So what's the machlokes? The machlokes, ultimately, again, is benofo, the leaves. Now, I will say, now what's the issue with the leaves? Because the leaves are hanging into the airspace of the lower garden. So on one hand, when it comes to the root system, everyone is going to agree that whatever's in the ground definitely belongs to Reuben, the upper garden. The problem is the leaves themselves extend into the airspace, so who do those belong to? Rabbi Meir says, look, the leaves go after the root, or go after the bulb, whatever's in the ground. The leaves aren't an independent entity. They're attached to the stuff in the ground. So therefore, just like the stuff in the ground, everyone is agreeing halacha l'maisa belongs to Reuben, the upper garden. So too, again, the leaves are also going to belong to Reuven. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we don't say that. We could look at the leaves and look at the bulb as two different things. I could agree that the bulb will belong ultimately again to Reuven, but the leaves will ultimately belong to Shimon. And both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are going according to previously established reasoning. What do they say? Disanyo hayotze min hagezel min hasharashin hareilu shabala karka di Rabbi Meir. So this is very interesting. So we'll say this is a separate halacha. I go ahead and I purchase a tree from Reuven. Now, in this case over here, I'm just purchasing one tree. I will say the halacha is when you purchase a tree, you just get a tree. You don't get any surrounding karka. You don't get any surrounding land. So now watch this. Now let's say from the tree that I bought, Baruch Hashem, there is another branch, like another tree. Geza, so ayotzi min hageza min hashrashin. So now, we'll say, if you imagine I bought this tree, and now from that tree, there is something extending off, right? Another outgrowth that is coming. Geza means the trunk, right? Or shrashin means the roots. The roots. Hare elu shabala karka. Ultimately, again, so both of these belong to the balakarka. It's interesting. So I bought this land from Ruvain. So we'll say, so I bought the tree. I get the tree. But anything comes out of the trunk, or anything that comes off of the roots, ultimately, again, that belongs to Ruvain, the landowner. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Huda says, Min hageza shel bala ilag, min hashrashin shel bala karka. Rabbi Huda says, no, what are you talking about? So we'll say now, Rabbi Meir's logic is, I only bought the tree. Therefore, by definition, anything else is coming out of the ground. If it's coming out of the ground, right, either actually or just sustainationally, right, is being sustained. That was a good one, right? Right, it is being grown from the ground. Then halacha l'maisa, that belongs to Reuben, the ground owner. Rabbi Huda says no. If it comes out of the trunk, then it's mine, the tree owner. If it comes out of the shrashin, the roots from the ground, then it belongs to Reuven. Shabala karka. Top of Kuf Yites. We'll say last amud of Meseches Bava Metzia. Utinan nami gabi arla. We'll say we have this same halacha when it comes to arla. What happened by arla? Ki agavna ilan ayotzi min hageza min hashrashin chayiv ba'arla div Rabbi Meir. So we'll say this is an interesting case. I have a tree. Remember again, trees are normally subject to arla. What's the halacha by arla? The halacha by arla is first 3 years you're not allowed to consume the produce. So watch this. So now I have a tree, Baruch Hashem, right? I observed arla in my tree. Now it turns out that my tree is sprouting looks like a new sapling, right? In other words, a new tree is growing off my tree. We're not just talking about like a branch over here. We're talking about what looks like really like an additional tree is growing out of my tree. So what's the halacha? If it's coming out of the trunk, or from the roots, chayiv ba'al Rabbi Meir. So we'll say Rabbi Meir says that halacha l'maisa, anything that grows out of that tree, whether it comes from the trunk or whether it comes from the roots, is considered to be coming out of the ground. Right? This is Rabbi Meir l'shita. So we'll say. So again, just in the connection over here, same Rabbi Meir said that when something grows out of the retaining wall, it always belongs to Reuven in the upper field. Why? Because it's growing out of his soil. And if it's growing out of your soil, then it belongs to you. So Rabbi Meir is espousing the same idea when it comes to trees. Right? That halacha l'maisa, again, if I buy a tree from Reuven, right, and now something is coming out of that tree, a new tree is growing off that tree, whether it's from the trunk or whether it's from the roots, it belongs to Reuven, the landowner. Anything that comes from the ground belongs to the owner of the ground. Arla, I have a tree, and I already observed Arla with my tree. And now a new tree is growing out of my tree, whether it be the trunk or the root system. Halacha l'maisa, now that new growth is subject to a new Arla cycle. If it comes from the ground, it belongs to the ground. Rabbi Huda says, min hageza pata min hashrashin chayiv. Rabbi Huda says, no. It depends where the tree is coming from. If the new tree is growing off the trunk, then it's just considered to be what? An extension of the old tree, and therefore no new obligation when it comes to Arla. But if it's coming from the root system, then it's going to be Chayiv in Arla. It's a brand new tree. So Rabbi says, so now the obvious Shayla is, why do you need all of these cases? In other words, so the Mishnah, I understand, the Mishnah was the Mishnah. Why do you need to illustrate the Machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda in 2 tree cases, right? The Gemara brought down 2 tree cases. One was a case of where I bought a tree from Reuven, and now again, a new tree comes off of either the trunk or the root system. So Rabbi Meir says, either way, that new tree belongs to Reuven, the landowner. Rabbi Huda says, if it comes from the trunk, it belongs to me. If it comes from the roots, it belongs to Reuven. And then we have the same case by Arla. So why do you have to mention both cases? Utzrichi, I need both cases. I'll tell you why. Diashmo inan kamaisa. If it would have just said the first case, which is the tree purchase case, Bahakam Rabbi Huda mishum dimamona. I would say maybe Rabbi Huda holds his position because it's a case of mammon. And in the case of monetary issues, we'll be a little bit more meka. Rabbi Huda will say, if I buy a tree from Reuven, and now the new tree comes off the trunk, it belongs to me. It belongs to me, the tree owner. If it comes off the roots, then it belongs to Reuven, the landowner. So maybe he'll hold that way in the case of mammon. In the case of monetary issues, aval gabe arla di isura. But arla, which is isser ema model remer, maybe Rabbi Huda gives it to Rabbi Meir that new growth is always subject to Arla. Wherever it goes ahead and it grows from, Kamash Malanda, no. Rabbi Huda holds his position even in a case of Arla. The Itmar Bahan, if you would have just only said the Arla case, Baha Kam Rabbi Meir, that's the case Rabbi Meir holds his position. Aval Bahi Maybe only in the case of other Rabbi Meir holds his position that everything that comes from the ground, that everything is considered to belong to the ground. But maybe in the case of a sale of a purchase, Rabbi Meir doesn't hold this way. Therefore, again, or agrees with Rabbi Huda. Therefore, tzricha. Therefore, we'll say need both cases. So, bottom line, we are left with the fundamental machlokes that really begins in the Mishnah, and that's where we're going to remain focused. We're going to remain focused for ourselves in the Mishnah right now. So I'll say, so again, we're left with essentially this machlokes of Reuven and Shimon are terraced farmers. Reuven's on top, Shimon's on the bottom. There's produce growing from the retaining wall, from the side wall. Who owns that? So Rabbi Meir says anything that grows from the soil of the upper field belongs to the upper field. Rabbi Huda says no. Halach Laisa belongs to the lower field. Rava comes along and says, really, they're not arguing about the bulb. Anything that grows in the ground, everyone is going to agree, ultimately belongs to the upper field. The shayla is on the leafy part that extends out of the ground. Who does that belong to? Do we say that since it comes from the bulb, it belongs to the upper field, or since it's in the airspace of the lower field, it belongs to the lower field? And now we see this is a far-reaching machlokes of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda that we now see in our Mishnah. We now see in the case of a purchase of a tree. That's case number 2, and we also see in the case of Arla. Halacha l'maisa, we'll see in just a moment. Let's go right to Bosai. Last section of Maseches Bava Metzia. Wow. Okay, Rabbi Shimon. Kol sha'al yachal livshot. Rabbi Shimon says that what's the halacha? Rabbi Shimon gives an interesting approach. He says, here's what we're going to do. Anything that Reuven could grab from the upper field is his. So in other words, whatever produce he could grab from the retaining wall, right, from standing in the upper field, that belongs to him. Anything that he can't take a hold of, ultimately, again, goes ahead and belongs to Shimon, the lower field. Says the Gemara, Amri Divrei Rabbi Yanai, U'bilvad shelo ye'enas. And I will say, this is very interesting. What does it mean that he's able to reach it? So I will say, so what it means to be able to reach it means reach it with ease, right? In other words, if Reuven goes ahead and calls over his friends, right, and they're holding him by his feet, lowering him down, right, and he's picking vegetables like nobody's business out of the retaining wall, that's not called able to reach. Able to reach means you're able to reach with relative ease. Whatever. It doesn't, obviously he's bending down to get it because it's on the ground, but he's bending down and he can reach it with relative ease. If you can reach it, and again, obviously, I will say this is still somewhat subjective, right? But Lamaisa again, if you can reach it with relative ease, then Halach Lamaisa belongs to him. Okay, so Gemara says, Bai Ravanan v'Tei Rabbi Yirmiyah, Magia lenofo ve'in magia leikaro, or magia leikaro ve'in magia lenofo mai. So I'll say, what happens if Reuven could reach, quote unquote, with relative ease, but he could only reach the leafy part, but not the bulb? Or he could only reach the bulb, but he can't reach the leafy part. So we'll say, thinking to yourself, how can you ever reach the bulb and not the leafy part? So Rashi points out, it could be a case where the way it's growing is diagonally, where part of the bulb is exposed. So if you can imagine, the plant that's growing out of the retaining wall is facing downward, and part of the bulb is exposed. So it's easier to grab the bulb than it is to go ahead and grab the leafy part. So in other words, what happens if he can reach it, quote unquote, with relative ease, but he can only reach part of the growth and not the entire thing? Teku. Gemara says, we're not sure what to do with that. All right, Rabosai, last section. So it's Amr Ephraim Safra Tamido Shoresh Lakish. So Ephraim Safra, that's his name. Ephraim, the scribe, who was the Talmud of Reish Lakish, said in the name of Reish Lakish. Right? So Amr Ephraim Safra Tamido Shoresh Lakish Mishum Reish Lakish. Halacha K'Rebbi Shimon. The halacha was Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi say, meaning what? That halacha l'maisa, the way to go ahead and resolve this issue about who retains the retaining wall produce is whatever Reuven, the upper field owner, is able to grab with quote unquote relative ease is his. Everything else is not his. So Rabbi say, so that's the way Gemara is suggesting that Reish Lakish paskins. Now, before we get to the last 2 lines, how do we paskin halacha l'maisa? So the Shulchan Aruch writes this. The Rambam, very quickly. The Rambam writes, Hilcho Shchenim, Parak Dal Halachata, Shtei Ginos, Zu Agav Zu, Vayarak Ben Sayim, Begova Ave Arsh Beineim, Kol Sha'elyon Yochel Livshot Es Edavalita, also Meikaro, Harehu, Shalo, Ubilvad, Shalo Yenos Es Atzmo, Vashar Shal Tachton, Hayamagil Nof of Yamagili Karo, Loita. So listen to this. The way the Rambam paskins is that Halacha L'maisa, we accept this idea of Rabbi Shimon. Says Rabbi Shimon, that halacha l'maisa, whatever you could reach, whatever Reuven, the upper field owner could reach, is his. Whatever ultimately, again, he can't reach is not his. Now the Rambam throws in one caveat over here. It has to be the ability to reach the bulb in the ground. If all he could reach is the leafy part, that's not enough. He has to be able to get into the ground and actually pull out the plants. As long as he's able to do that, then halacha l'maisa, it belongs to him. Unable to do that, then halacha l'maisa, again, it does not belong to him. So we literally see that the halacha accepts the position of Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so we'll say, so that's the halacha l'maisa. How does the Gemara end? The beautiful end to the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Amru kamei de Shavar Malka. They said this in front of Shavar Malka. So we'll say, who's Shavar Malka? So Rashi says over kamei de Shavar Malka. Linear Rashi says, Malka Mamish. Umelech Paras Haya. So Shavar Malka, King Shapur, was literally, again, an actual Persian king. He was a Persian king. And we'll say, what happened? So why are they saying this word? Ubaki Bedina. So apparently King Shapur had a real interest in legal systems and in Jewish law. So they used to share some of these halachos with him. Umelech Parasaya, Ubaki Bedinim, Vamru Allah Rabbi Shimon Demasnisin Kamei, the Kalsa. So ultimately, so they said this in front of King Shapur. Okay. So, and by the way, Tosas also points out over here, he says, Nir Lefarish Kiperish Kuntras, the Shavar Malka Hayabaki Bahalachas. So again, they're saying this over in front of a Persian king, King Shapur. Why? Because apparently he was very well versed in halachas. And what did he say? Amr lahu apiryon nimtiye l'Rabbi Shimon. Extend our grace to Rabbi Shimon. Rashi says, Chin shalanu. Essentially, both say this was a Persian shkoyach, right? A Persian shkoyach was nimtiye, right? Amr lahu apiryon nimtiye. Give our grace. Give our chen ultimately again to Rabbi Shimon. We'll say incredible Gemara. So we'll say so. This is how the Masechta ends. So we'll say so. So first of all, it's so fascinating that at the end of the day, King Shapur goes ahead and makes it at the end of the Masechta. Right? He is the last personality mentioned over next to Rabbi Shimon. Why is King Shapur? So we'll say this is very striking. Shavar Malka is such a fascinating name. So it's really Shapur Malka, but the way the Gemara calls him is Shavar Malka. So we'll say, so why is he here? So we'll say, because at the end of the day, if you think about it, we're all Shavar Malka. What does that mean? That we'll say Shavar Malka represents the totality over here. Shavar means broken, and Malka means monarchy. We'll say each and every one of us possesses this dialectic, these two parts to us. There are parts of me that are so profoundly broken. And they've been broken for such a long time. You know, in life, there are new things that break, and there are old things that just remain broken. And then there are parts of me that are so beautiful, so monarchical, so incredible. So it's almost as if the Masechta is ending off, we'll say, with this identity that each of us possess of being a Shavar Malka. When you come to an end of a Masechta, what's part of the beauty of the end of a Masechta? What's part of the beauty is that I'm more Malka than Shavar. Right, for these couple of moments when we just finished Maseches Bava Metzia, I'm more Malka than Shavar. And I will say it's such an incredible, that's the feeling of elation. When you finish something in Torah, I feel a sense of completion, I feel a sense of wholeness, I feel a sense of oneness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So ultimately, again, Shavar Malka, Chazal could have put him anywhere. They could have put this, right, they could have put this conversation anywhere. No, you got to end up with Shavar Malka. As you come to an end of a Masechta, it's true. There's so many things that are broken inside of me. But now I just finished Maseches Bava Metzia. There are so many beautiful things that are whole. There's so much monarchical beauty that exists inside of me. And what's my whole avoda in life? It would be beautiful to say that I should eliminate the shir, I should eliminate the brokenness. No one ever eliminates their brokenness. But what you can do is you could eclipse your brokenness with a whole bunch of monarchical completion. That is the entire avoda of life. Become more malka than shavar. I will say, what's the last halacha in this Masechta? The last halacha in this Masechta is halacha Rabbi Shimon. So I will say, what is the halacha? What does Rabbi Shimon teach us? If you can grab it, it's yours. That's the halacha. If you can grab it, it's yours. How many times in life do we convince ourselves that we can't accomplish things? How many times in life do we tell ourselves that things are beyond our reach? No, it's too far out of reach for me. Rabbi Shimon says, did you try? Did you try to grab it? Did you try to take hold of it? Did you try to make it yours? Because something amazing happens in life. When you kind of bend your knee or bend your shoulder and get ready to work a little bit harder, you begin to see that a lot of things in life are really within reach. And if it's within reach, and if you could grab it, it's yours. Don't be afraid to extend yourself. Don't be afraid to push yourself. Don't be afraid to grab upwards and grab downwards. If you can take hold of it, then it is yours. I will say, today we celebrate the completion, not fully celebrate the Meretz Hashem. We have a postponed siyum next Tuesday, Meretz Hashem. But again, today we celebrate the completion of Maseches Bava Metzia. I will say tomorrow it's time to bend down, depending on where you keep your Gemaras on your shelves, right? And you're going to go ahead and you're going to grab something else. What is this new beautiful thing you're going to grab? It's called Bava Basra. I will say for some of us, Bava Metzia was perfect. It was incredible. I was at shir, I was attentive, and for others, Bava Metzia maybe started strong, and then like a lot of other things in life, it kind of like wanes a little bit and whatever. I will say tomorrow, a new haskala. Tomorrow, something beautiful is sprouting out of our spiritual retaining wall called Bava Basra. And it is yours for the taking. But no one's going to deliver it to you. Right? No one's going to say, here, eat this, or here, take this. You have to take it. But once you're willing to take it, there is no telling what you could accomplish. Once you're willing to take it, for that little bit, you could be a little less shavor and a little bit more malka. Tomorrow, the new journey of Maseches Bava Basra begins. I will say it was a tremendous zechus to learn this magnificent Masechta together. Can't wait to Meretz Hashem till tomorrow. I will say Mazel Tov, and maybe be Zocheh Meretz Hashem to become more Malka than Shavar. We should be Zocheh Meretz Hashem to grab every single spiritual accomplishment that is within reach. We should be Zocheh Meretz Hashem to give nachas to our Kadosh Baruch Hu, and our learning and our siyum should be a zechus for all of Klal Yisrael. All right, Chevron Zoom, Mazel Tov, everyone. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov.